Me, all these seem to come together and just be the steady chipping away at Marian devotion, which is it's at the heart of the church and has been for so many saints and for so many popes. So I agree. I think this is um, I think this could weaken people's love for Our Lady, understanding of Our Lady's role in the church, in our Lord's life, and in our own lives individually as Catholics.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father John Lovell back again with Hope in the Desert. I have a wonderful guest today, Vatican Correspondent and one of the newest members of Pelican Plus, Michael Haynes. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Father. It's lovely to be with you.
Would you mind giving my American audience, especially, a little biography about yourself? What brought you to tradition? What brought you to being a journalist at the Vatican living in Rome?
Yeah, surely. So I come from the northwest of England, from near an old Roman town called Chester. And I come from a Catholic family, so growing up, the faith was always very much part of my daily life, and I, because of that, always had quite an attraction to trying to do something with that in later life, if possible. So I went to a Catholic college that was being set up in Ireland called Newman College Ireland, and it was basically to a style of imitating what you have so successfully in the States, which is these Catholic third level centers of education, especially the liberal arts centers. So I went there for a couple of years, and it was linked with Thomas More College in New Hampshire. So the small handful of us studying in Ireland went over to Thomas More to finish off our degrees and get the official slip of paper we needed to show that we'd actually been studying for the last 4 years. That was when was that? That was 2019. So I then came back to England, and I was sort of pottering around looking for things to do in that sort of Catholic field, because in the United Kingdom, it's much harder to find work in the Catholic field. There's more volunteering positions, but not really many areas you can actually give your full time to in working. So I was looking around. I was just working quietly during that first sort of 6 months to 9 months of 2020 and the craziness that was COVID and the lockdowns. And then towards the autumn of that year, came across an opening with LifeSite News, which was for just a journalist doing some reporting around the time of the US election in 2020 of that year. So I joined up. I was doing a little bit of writing on political news, Catholic news, also trying to present some UK news, which wasn't all that much covered at the time. And then from then, just really focused on Catholic news, especially because that was where my interests lay. And I was more able to present that than I was to present the nuances of American politics. And so it was from there that I sort of gradually realized I was developing a fondness for Catholic journalism, or presenting the faith through writing in that format. And I came out to Rome in 2022, and got accredited with the Holy See in order to fulfill my sort of journalistic style out here, and have then just been based back and forth between England and Rome since then, which it's been very, very intense, quite interesting though, and it's some really quite poignant scenes in the life of the church, which I never really expected to see in person, especially with the synods, the death of Pope Benedict, and then Pope Francis, and then the conclave, none of which I ever really anticipated I would actually have a front row seat for. So it's very much a blessing, I think, to be able to have that opportunity and report on the church from the center of the church in a way.
You have a wonderful website, and we will put it in the show notes, permariam.com. And on there, you have an image of meeting Pope Francis. And in the subtitle of the photo, you state that you were at as the photo was being taken, that you were questioning Pope Francis about the changes and the restrictions to the Latin Mass. If we may ask, what was his response?
That's right. Off the top of my head, I think he said to go read Motu Proprio, and the answer is in there. It was quite a short response. Um, I suppose I wasn't expecting a great lengthy answer because I was one in a queue of many, but I thought it was a very unfulfilling answer. But it's I suppose it spoke to much of the logic or lack thereof surrounding the restrictions which were placed on the traditional mass. Really, certainly he wasn't keen to be asked, I think.
Where are we in Europe and in England? And I am the type of American that looks at Great Britain as separate from Europe, not only because of Brexit, but because it is an island. It does have a distinct culture. Not that all the countries of Europe don't; they do, obviously, but it seems something very distinct in Great Britain. But if you could tell us, especially from your generation, we always like to speak about generations. Um, how is the traditional movement doing both in Great Britain and in Europe?
I think in Great Britain, it's certainly growing. If there is any growth in the church, it's generally seen in the traditional movement. So I come from the Northwest, where there's quite a cluster of traditional parishes. With we have the fraternity, we have the institute, we also have the Society of Pius X. So we've got quite a little stronghold up there. Also in London, and then down towards the southwest in Cornwall, there are some fairly thriving parishes. In context, they're not thriving in terms of American standards. I know when I went to the States for my education, and I went to the local fraternity, St. Peter Parish. They had a couple of hundred people there, and I found that very impressive. And the Americans I was chatting to were saying, "Oh, this is actually, it's you've not seen anything yet," kind of thing. So the movement is smaller and it's slightly slower than it is in the States, but it's definitely growing. More so after the lockdowns as well.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I think COVID has been a great help to tradition. There is no doubt of that. And I can tell you from personal experience, I used to help at a fraternity parish to distribute communion, and the church probably could hold 250 people, and they had three masses every Sunday, and every single mass was packed. Um, I lived very briefly in Atlanta, and there was a society parish down there as well. And again, same thing, probably could hold 250, 300 people. They had three, four masses, all of them packed. And sometimes at inconvenient times. I mean, for me to go to mass at 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon is kind of inconvenient, but I mean, it was still packed. And it was always a pleasure to see, because what a lot of people don't realize is that you can tell the growth of a parish by how many screaming babies there are, how many talking babies there are. And that is always a wonderful indicator. The priest and the other parishioners might not always like the screaming babies, but it is certainly a sign of that. Very recently, we just added a new doctor to the church from England, the first doctor that wrote and spoke in modern English. Obviously, there is St. Bede, there is St. Anselm. They wrote and spoke mainly in Latin and in Old English. As an Englishman, how is it to see someone who converted from Anglicanism, and at a time was considered treason almost to convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism in the mid 19th century? How is it for you and for traditional Catholics in England to have a new doctor of the church?
I found it quite moving, to be honest. I was at the mass where he was proclaimed a doctor of the church, and I thought it very powerful because, if anything, in England, I think we sometimes lack the go-getting attitude that is found elsewhere, particularly so in the States. And my hope was that something like this, to see Cardinal Newman made a doctor of the church, would provide the graces, but also maybe just the practical impetus for English Catholics to be increasingly proud of their faith in the public sphere. I think there's very much the idea that English Catholics have to almost be ashamed of being Catholic because for so long there was the persecution against the faith. And then even when persecution wasn't there, there was a sort of a cold mistrust and a tolerance from the Church of England, but not much more than a tolerance. So to see someone who was such a high profile convert and who endured so much public vitriol for converting, and as you say, at the time when it was almost social suicide to do so, I think please God, it can really be that moment of grace that we need, and also it's challenging for those in the Church of England who are thinking people and trying to do the right thing to have this figure of Cardinal Newman placed before them once again, to have to reacquaint themselves with his life and realize yeah, he actually studied everything and realized the Catholic Church is the one true church. So hopefully there will be graces and we'll see more conversions to the Catholic Church as well. So it was quite impressive, actually.
It quite a joy for me, even though I'm an American. We take great pride that the two miracles attributed to His Eminence came from Boston and Chicago, and I'm originally from Chicago, and so it was great pride that the American Church was able to help bring about his cause. Because I remember 25, 30 years ago when I started in the seminary, everyone talked about Newman. And it was always, well, why isn't he a saint yet? And the story I always was told is, well, we're just waiting for the miracles. Everything was lined up. All the documentation was done by the 1990s, investigations and everything that the Vatican do. There were just no miracles, and then they finally came. And it was great to see, as a traditional Catholic, someone who takes very much pride, and pride in the good sense of having a new doctor of the church. What do you say to the skeptics, to the critics in the traditional world that says, no, really, Newman was a modernist, or at least he was hijacked by the modernist wing of the church?
I suppose, if anything, it should make the traditional Catholics much more vocal in the presentation of Newman's work, in a good presentation of it, because I think it is certainly true. There is an attempt to, which we saw under the last pontificate, really, there was an attempt to try and hijack Newman's words in order to justify, erroneous ideas of development of doctrine. So I think that there is a danger which we should be wary of. It shouldn't make us in any way ashamed of or Cardinal Newman, or not wanting to jump on the bandwagon of praising what a happy event this is. But I think, if anything, it should spur us to study him more with trusted scholars in order to actually properly understand him, because there will, I think, be a battle over the identity of Newman for a good while yet to come, and it's sort of being played out, in the last couple of years, and I think we're still seeing that somewhat now.
I just read a month or two ago a wonderful book called A Preface to Newman's Theology. And the author made clear that anyone who doubts the orthodoxy of Newman's work has not truly read Newman, or has only read parts of it, selective parts of it. And you obviously have the popes of the early 20th century, obviously Leo the 13th making him a cardinal, which took a lot of doubt away, because he was, for lack of a better term, dogged most of his Catholic life with several accusations that I don't want to go into. But then you had Leo the 13th make him a cardinal, kind of a surprise to everyone. And then you have Pius X, Benedict XV coming out, possibly even Pius XI, but don't quote me on that, basically answering questions that no, Newman is solid. So, Michael, I find it odd that any traditional Catholic would have a problem with this, other than those that, in the Sede camp that question whether or not we've had a pope. and whether or not he's a doctor because of that. But I'm just saying, on his merit, on his work, he seems to have earned both the title of saint and doctor of the church. And it's something that traditionalists should, in my opinion, be very proud of. And again, proud in the good Catholic sense, not to hold it over other people. In your work, you've been now in the Vatican press corps for 3 years. What has surprised you about your work in Rome? And just to let the American audience know, traveling from England to Rome is not as difficult as we might think it is. Think about traveling from like Chicago to Atlanta. That would be a similar um, way of doing it. I think sometimes Americans kind of look at Europe as being a lot bigger than it actually is, and vice versa. I think a lot of Europeans kind of look at the United States of America as actually being smaller. I know several European priests who fly into New York and tell me, I have to get to Montana. I'm like, well, you're going to have to get on another plane then, or drive for 30 hours, one of the two. But how is it working at the Vatican, especially as a traditional Catholic?
It's very strange in one sense. A lot of people, when I've got into conversations and I end up saying, "Oh yes, I work in Rome," a lot of people say, "Oh wow, that must be so amazing," and I think certainly there is that very beautiful opportunity to be able to be close to so many holy sites and the shrines of so many saints. But I found it very on a day-to-day basis. I find it very bizarre because you're surrounded by the beauty, the historic beauty and the grandeur of the church, and yet you see it, those churches, both physically and more metaphorically, just filled with people who don't have any real understanding of the faith, whether they are prelates or clergy or whether they're just people passing through. Um, and so I've come to almost look at the reporting as having you have to have a sort of a medical mindset in the sense that so when you encounter some very deeply disturbing story that one has to report on, it's a little bit like I imagine a doctor must have to go into that mindset when he's in the surgery and sort of you deal with what's in front of you, and then you probably think about it afterwards. But that's something which I think has struck me most, that reporting on terrible things like, for instance, the Rupnik scandal, or thinking about the spiritual devastation wreaked by a number of documents in recent years, which they're more than just words on the paper. They're doing real damage to people's souls, or fiducia supplicans. It could be condoning in people's minds lifestyles that will lead them to hell. The reality of that is very striking to see on the ground. When everybody will be smiling with you, that they'll be friendly or exteriorly very professionally friendly, and yet there's such a bizarre contradiction between the appearances of what you're facing and then the buildings and the history that you see and the saints who've worked so hard in Rome. That juxtaposition I found very, very bizarre.
Do you find, as the title of the show is, Hope in the Desert, do you find any hope in the Vatican and in Rome? Many in the English-speaking world are probably familiar with the works of Malachi Martin. We hear story after story coming out of the Vatican lately, and I don't mean to sound like Francis by saying, "Who am I to judge?" But have you seen saints among those that are working at the Vatican, or is it just all modernists at this point?
I think there are definitely signs of hope, which are maybe there may be quiet developments, and possibly, particularly under Pope Francis, that was almost necessary in order not to get shot down. But there are very much signs of hope, whether that's just in the priests you'll meet, you might bump into priests or the priests working day to day quietly, keeping the faith, keeping the mass going, ministering to people that way, or whether it's much more public events, like the recent pilgrimage a couple of weeks ago. Those are definitely signs of hope for sure. And also I think the shrines, for instance, that I mentioned a moment ago, are also a sign of hope because they show you that no matter what crisis the church goes through, the church remains, and the saints who have suffered martyrdom or who have been not martyred but have suffered a white martyrdom, maybe from those within the church, are testament to that. So there is that sense of the Catholicity of the church by just witnessing all of the church's history. You realize, yes, Christ has not betrayed us. He's not broken his promise. God is still with his church. We just have to pull away a little bit of the of the weeds that are maybe covering the jewels beneath.
And correct me if I'm wrong, not only does the Society of Pius X, the Institute of Christ the King, and as well as the Fraternity of St. Peter have parishes or chapels in or around the city of Rome, but the fraternity parish is doing something quite unique. They are offering the traditional Latin Mass, but pre 1955, correct? They're trying to have a renaissance of what the Roman Rite should be like in Rome, correct?
I think on a day-to-day basis, I may be wrong on this. I believe they follow the 62 calendar, but I'm not 100% sure. But I think there is, as you say, there is more of a revival of the older style Triduum, particularly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as Americans, that's what we see coming across on social media is those images. And a reminder to everyone, day in and day out, there's not much of a difference between the pre-55 and the 1962. Yes, there are some days that are different, but that's just typical in the church of editing the calendar. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But I just found it as a Roman Catholic as a sign of hope, especially during COVID, that I was seeing a parish, a Roman parish, trying to do their best to do the Mass of the Ages as it was done before any of the, what we say here in America, tinkeritis began in the 1950s, the tinkering of the Mass and changing things. And so that's always good to hear and good for pilgrims to know that there are places still in Rome that they can get the traditional Mass and be nourished by that. You recently joined Pelican Plus, and you, along with Murray Rundis, I like to call him Murray de Profundis. He will be on the show next week for those watching. You are doing Pelican Brief, and I have to tell you, even though it's fairly new, every morning I look forward to seeing what you're posting. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing for Pelican Plus, specifically with Pelican Brief.
Yeah, certainly. So I just came on board with Pelican at the start of this month. So with Murray, where there's the Pelican Brief, as you mentioned, which will be giving, as I understand, a good overview for readers of church news, but also news in the political sphere and relevant to that. And I will be doing not so much the political side, but kind of sticking to my tried and tested beat. So giving Vatican reporting, giving some news and analysis on day-to-day developments, but also trying to give the breaking news for large announcements as they happen. And that will be relating to news directly about the Pope, or perhaps more generally about the Vatican Curia. And also, I'm looking forward to, well, really in a couple of weeks, the first trip outside of Italy that Pope Leo will be making, going off to Turkey and Lebanon. And then we'll see in the new year, just after Epiphany, he'll have the first extraordinary consistory of cardinals. So for me, I think those would be quite interesting moments in the still quite young life of this pontificate. And so I'm quite excited just to be trying to bring analysis of that to Pelican and help grow readers' understanding really of what's happening out here in Rome.
Could you, for our audience, tell us the difference between an ordinary consistory where cardinals are created and an extraordinary consistory?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the ordinary one is that which we are more accustomed to having. Pope Francis created a large number of cardinals in the course of his 12-year pontificate.
He had
But
he
the
had 10 ordinary consistories. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. No, no, thank you. I was trying to remember my notes which I compiled at the time of his funeral and I had that kind of information, but that's been pushed to the back of my mind now. Um and whereas the extraordinary consistory is, and I will get the exact quote here from the canon law page that I was just double checking earlier today, but that is to respond to particular issues in the life of the church, and it is much, much more rare. So the precise definition from the canon law is an extraordinary consistory takes place when the special needs of the church and more serious matters suggest it. So we've not had any particular theme or even study topic, if you like, given for this, but we have seen them used previously. We saw Pope Francis, I think, hold 3 or maybe 2 extraordinary consistories, uh, one of which was the very famous or infamous, controversial one when Cardinal Casper pushed his resolution for the divorced to receive Holy Communion. Pope Benedict did not hold any, which is quite surprising. So I think that shows just how rare they are. Now, we did see at the conclave, particularly in the congregations, the general congregation meetings before the actual conclave vote, we saw that a number of cardinals were calling for more interaction, essentially, between the Pope and the cardinals, because that was something that had been lacking under Pope Francis, who famously tried to separate the cardinals, in a sense, from having these meetings, which centered power around him or the Vatican Curia, but it meant there wasn't really much of a chance for discussion groups to form, or even for the cardinals to get to know each other. So it could be that Leo is going to start having these more regularly, maybe every 2 years or so, or maybe there is really something he has identified as wanting to be the first step that he's going to tackle in his pontificate.
And correct me if I'm wrong, during the conclave, the cardinals, which is their right, actually added at least a day, if not 2 days, to their general congregation meetings before they went actually into the conclave, correct? To get to know each other better.
I think there was, what was it? They started quite early on. That would be is
There
that what
there
you
was
mean?
there
Yeah.
yeah, there was a for the right term to use, there was a fury that really the Tuesday, the Pope Francis died on Monday, Easter Monday. On Tuesday, they started meeting, and there was concern that they were starting this before all the cardinals got there. Which actually, if you look back at previous pontificates, that's quite normal. The cardinals that actually live in Rome start the process. There's actually a lot of work to do in getting a conclave prepared. But I could be wrong on this, but I could have sworn that in the time frame of when they could start and when they must start, there was some flexibility, and they actually used a little bit of that for a day or two. But if you're not positive on that, it's no big deal. But I just remember reading that and thinking that's not necessarily a bad thing if they're taking an extra day or two in order to do that. For someone that is trying to basically get the story, but at the same time not to be sensational, not to be clickbait. How do you go about that? I mean does your English persona help of just keep calm and carry on? I mean, what makes you do that? Because you see a lot of people out there is, I mean, you can't get to the computer fast enough to post something. You seem a little bit more reserved, and this is one of the reasons why you're probably my favorite Vatican correspondent, at least in the English speaking world. Uh, how do you, as a traditional Catholic, but still as a fairly young man, avoid that temptation of being the first to the story?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon which I have mulled over quite a lot. I think the maybe the English characteristic you mentioned possibly does play a part in it because a friend out here, Edward Penton, who I name, and it's a name I'm sure many are familiar with. He's also from England, and he to my mind very much embodies that very measured style of reporting. But I think also a large part is that when you're based out in Rome reporting on the life of the church, you're in person. You're not sitting from behind the keyboards thousands of miles away, never, attending events or never seeing things in person. So if I were to write an article about, Cardinal XYZ, it's not unlikely that within the next few days I could bump into him, or you could bump into some official who knows him, and that I think makes it much more real because you have to be prepared to defend whatever you write should you actually be called upon to do so in person, um, which I think is quite healthy because you can be very brave when you're not in person, but not quite as brave when you're actually face to face with somebody. So that is, I think, very much that's very much been a learning point for me after moving out and realizing that. And also, there's, I think, being in person and meeting individuals who are working in and around the Vatican, learning from other journalists who've been doing this for a while, you also realize that sometimes there's not a cartoon villain that we might wish for there to be in every situation. There are nuances that are not immediately apparent, and that people aren't going to want to tell you because they're worried about breaking confidences, and so that aspect also I think is one in which the church doesn't marry well with journalism, and so I think always having a measured approach to it, trying to have true charity, not some sort of fake nicey idea of charity, but always looking for the good of people's souls in how you report is quite important. So I hope to try and do that with the articles I write, but it's not always easy, given the topics that can crop up.
As we discussed earlier about generations, you are coming up in really the first generation, end of the millennials, beginning of Gen Z, as they call it. But you're really one of the first generations where you grew up. Your entire life was in that 24-hour news cycle. Your job obviously is very much dependent on technology, using that technology, and let everyone know that the internet, computers, all this, they're all tools. All right. There is some horrible things on the internet that we know of. There is also some great things on the internet, per Miriam, Pelican Plus being just two to name. I don't mind name dropping both of those. But how do you, who your livelihood is dependent on this technology, how do you, if you don't mind me asking a somewhat personal question, how do you keep yourself from being sucked in, for lack of a better term?
It is actually a huge challenge, and I found particularly so with things like Twitter, because when you're the sole person responsible for reporting, it's very tempting just to endlessly stay on things like Twitter, where you'll get the news instantly. I think it's not some sort of secret formula. I think just ensuring you prioritize things like morning prayer, evening prayer, other daily devotions, be they daily prayers, be they, if you wish to say, a portion of the office or the little office or something like that. I think making sure that you don't find excuses to skimp on those things. Trying, especially in a place where you have ready access to Mass, ensuring that you get to Mass. And I think that can be, you have to be prudent about it, so you fit your work in around Mass. You don't sort of go out to Mass and therefore sort of miss everything you're supposed to be working on. So and that requires then a little bit more rigor in life. If you plan ahead, realizing tomorrow there's going to be an evening event I have to cover. If I want to get to mass, I have to go to bed early so I can get up early to get this morning mass. So I think just the very the very old but very tried and tested methods of having a little bit of self-discipline and ensuring you don't cave to yourself basically and become lazy.
I think you specifically um, have an advantage as well, that you can easily take a break and just walk the streets of Rome, which is a museum in and of itself, and a beautiful museum. I often tell people this. Um, in Chicago, we have the Art Institute of Chicago, and usually one day a week, maybe one day a month, it's free for Illinois citizens. And I remember going there on the free days and just walking around in the calming sense, not having the phone on, not having any of that. And so that's a great benefit to you and to all Romans, and some would say to most Europeans, that they could just simply unplug, even just for a short time, and go over and see these beautiful churches, these beautiful monuments that, especially in the American world, we don't necessarily have, at least not in abundance as they do in Europe. So I think that is very, very good. I do want to move on though. Uh, you wrote a wonderful book. In fact, this is one of the reasons that we're speaking today. Um, a wonderful book called Mary the Motherly Co-Redemptrix. And I think it's very proper and apt that we speak about that today, because last week, the Dicastery of the Doctrine of Faith came out with a note. Could you give us a little summary of what that note was, and why your book now is so important for Catholics?
Certainly. So the dicastery's note essentially, well, in not essentially, it did quite literally say that it is always inappropriate to use the term co-redemptrix when referring to Mary's work alongside Christ, with Christ, in the act of the redemption. Interestingly, that because we're now in this ridiculous case where they don't issue the definitive Latin text, they issue it in many translations of modern languages. We we presume the Italian is the definitive, but there was a peculiar translation issue with the English where it said um, it is inappropriate, I think, and then it's being changed to say now it's always inappropriate, or it would be inappropriate. It's now always inappropriate, and that is more in line with the Italian version. Um, so this document essentially, in making that argument, it had it was a long text, but in that specific section regarding Our Lady as Co-Redemptrix, there were about 6 or 7 paragraphs, and it used heavily Cardinal Ratzinger's opinions against the term, and it used Pope Francis's very well-known arguments against the term, and all the wealth of previous papal usages of the term, the Vatican's own pronouncements. It just compiled into a huge footnote, and I think the document said that some popes have used this term without clarification, and then had a footnote showing all this wealth of teaching, which was just being sort of pushed aside in a sense. And it's caused, arguably, it's raised the profile of the theology of Our Lady as Co-Redemptrix much more so than it would had this document never appeared.
Oh no, absolutely, and I'm kind of happy for it, because I think it's a topic that uh, Catholics need to take the time to learn. And we were discussing this earlier about catechesis at the Vatican, and kind of going in as a traditional Catholic, realizing that both in the press corps and sometimes even with uh, the bishops that work there, it's just this, like, they don't necessarily have that background, that traditional background, that sometimes traditionalists get so used to that they forget others don't have that. Why did you write this book? This book was written, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2019. It's a wonderful book. I read it over the weekend, and I'm glad that I did. It certainly calmed me down. But what drove a young man in his 20s to write a book about Mary Co-Redemptrix?
It was actually a project that I started in my university summer. I, for some reason, felt very, very drawn to the devotion of Our Lady as Co-Redemptrix, particularly. I think it's much more alive in Europe. The devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows, particularly in Italy or in Spain and Portugal, where they have these very beautiful depictions of Our Lady, the Sorrowful Mother. And for some reason, I found myself drawn to that, and I had the opportunity to work on it as my academic thesis with a brilliant advisor, a Dominican from England, Father Thomas Queen. And then I expanded it a little bit and published it in my home diocese with the approval of the bishop there. But I was really, and I still am, very convinced that devotion to Our Lady as Co-Redemptrix is a very natural part of having a healthy Marian devotion. And also that it's so key to our times, because to me, the devotion to Our Lady when she's suffering with Christ, she emptying herself with him and for humanity, is so it's so in contradiction to the evils that we see pushed in modern society, where we see impurity of every kind pushed at us as a norm. We see selfishness posited as being generous or being normative, and we see that in things like abortion and contraception. The image of Our Lady there suffering at the foot of the cross struck me as one which was so necessary for our times, just to counteract all of that. And that's why I think if more Catholics can come to understand and love Our Lady, and by witnessing or just reading through the beautiful passages which the fathers and the saints have written for centuries, then I think that can only help the church and help society gradually recover what we've lost.
As I said, I'm hoping that this document that came from the dicastery is actually going to benefit Catholics, especially traditional Catholics, to dig deeper in their catechesis on Mary. However, do you see this document affecting not only the understanding of Our Lady of Co-Redemptrix and Our Lady of Mediatrix of All Graces, but also some of the devotions? Like, many people on both sides of the Atlantic have devotion to Our Lady of Grace, specifically in Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal. Um, do you see as you already stated with Our Lady of Sorrows, Mother of Sorrows, do you see something of an unraveling that could happen because of this, that they're almost starting to poke, for lack of a better term, at the dogmas, especially Immaculate Conception?
I do sense that it feels like there's an insult to Our Lady with this document, and I think there's a continued push to minimalize Marian devotion. And far better theologians have also noted this. There's a Marian Franciscan in the UK, Father Serafino Lanzetta. He highlighted this as part of the move towards sort of minimalizing Our Lady's prominence in Catholic life. And I think that also ties into the document the Vatican issued in March of 2024, or maybe it was April, but the spring of that year, and in which they essentially sort of abnegated their authority to decide on alleged apparitions, which to my mind also meant that you can have what may be a true vision alongside what may be a fake alleged vision, but by the Vatican refusing to weigh in and decide which is true and which is not, it's allowing them both to have equal status and to therefore relativize and thus sort of remove any import we should pay to things like that, particularly to Marian apparitions. And we've seen things like a push to downplay the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima coming from the Pontifical Marian Academy out here in Rome. To me, all these seem to come together and just be the steady chipping away at Marian devotion, which is at the heart of the church and has been for so many saints and for so many popes. So I agree. I think this is um, I think this could weaken people's love for Our Lady, understanding of Our Lady's role in the church, in our Lord's life, and in our own lives individually as Catholics.
No, absolutely. And I want to encourage as we wrap up the show, and we will put a link for the book at Per Mariam, Mary and the Motherly Co-Redemptrix. I do recommend everyone reading your book. It's a short book. It will take one or two sittings to get through it. Before we end, is there anything else you would like to tell us? Anything else that you would like to share, especially to a mostly American audience here?
It's I suppose to reiterate what I mentioned earlier, in that maybe to thank the American Catholics for being um, very ardent in the faith and very public in the faith, which is something I took great heart from when I was there, and hopefully more and more of that spirit will cross the Atlantic and make its way into England. Um, and it's I think the liberals, the old liberals in Europe, also fear that. They fear the strength of American Catholics, and so to be living in old liberal Europe, that also is quite encouraging to see. To see that the flag of the faith being very prominently flown across the water.
Does it surprise you to see that fervor in traditional Catholicism coming from a country that prides itself on the separation of church and state, that prides itself on English Protestant philosophy of government? Do you find that surprising?
I do, to an extent. Yes, I've always attributed it perhaps to just the characteristics, the national characteristics being much more willing to delve into a problem and solve it. Excuse me. But it is very odd without that history, as you say, that European nations have of being steeped in the church and the faith. Um, I don't. It's not something I've looked at much. I don't have a particular insight into it, though.
No, it's certainly true, and I even as an American, uh, kind of admire that. I mean, it's Americans always, in almost any generation, are the type of people that want to roll up their sleeves and get the work done. And um, you saw that in World War One, you saw that in World War Two, and that spirit is still there. It's not as strong as it was, but it certainly is true. But next time you're in America, Michael, I hope you'll be able to come to Chicago. I would love to take you to Our Lady of Sorrows Basilica in Chicago, and you will see the great faith that Americans have towards the Sorrowful Mother. I can tell you this: I don't know if it was written at the Basilica, but I know it was started, at least in this country, the Sorrowful Mother Novena. So I do want to assure you that there are many Americans who have a deep devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows, and always appreciate your work. Appreciate you taking the time to come on my little show here on Pelican Plus. Please know that I'll be praying for you. Please remember me when you enter those glorious churches in Rome, those glorious shrines, and please keep my audience in your prayer. Ladies and gentlemen, again, Michael Haynes of permariam.com. Please go to his website, take a look at that. Please follow us on Pelican Plus and Pelican Brief in order to get the latest news from Rome. Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, God bless.